So let's get into some of your background, Rand. What got you into this? It always puzzles me when people research Atlantis. I go, what got you into Atlantis? What is it a mystery? Was there some facts laid in front of you, or was there some sort of anomaly that you've seen, or what's your route in to look for Atlantis, and how does it all come about for you?
Well, like in one weekend, I've told this story many times, and I don't want it to be overemphasized because I only spent one weekend doing this. But I was writing a science fiction script, and I just came up with the idea of putting Atlantis in Antarctica in the science fiction script. Now, I went off to the library and started to do some research about Atlantis, and that's when it turned from being a script into a research project, which I then continued on for decades. And what I found at the library was a map of Atlantis that was in a book created in 1665. Athanasius Kircher, he was a Jesuit priest living in Rome. And he had access to all the loot that the Romans had taken from the Egyptians. So he found this map, and he reproduced it in a book in 1665. And that map, which you often will see, is a map of Atlantis, supposedly in the North Atlantic Ocean. And it's peculiar in the sense that there's a little compass on it that points down, which means that north is down. So you have to turn the map upside down
Sure.
to get our orientation. I came to that map with the concept of, oh, hey, listen, rather than turning the map upside down, maybe we should turn our globe upside down and look at it. And at that time, I came across Charles Hapgood's book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. And in it, for the first time for me, there was a picture of an ice-free Antarctica. And the thing that struck me about it was that Kircher's 1665 map of Atlantis was a remarkably similar map to an ice-free Antarctica. And of course, this is in the book Atlantis Beneath the Ice and on our website under Atlantis in Antarctica. But the thing about it was it seems more than coincidence to me. It seems, because I knew that in 1665, Europeans weren't capable of determining longitude at sea. That didn't happen until the 1770s.
That's the bombshell, Rand. Sorry, Rand. That's the bombshell, isn't it? If this is true, then this is like mammoth. This is a mammoth concept.
Yeah. See, for what it meant to me was that, hey, now there is a piece of physical evidence, this map that Kircher published in 1665, which is a remarkably accurate map of Antarctica without the ice. And we didn't know what Antarctica looked like, even vaguely, about beneath the ice until 1958. That's like 3 centuries after Kircher's book had been published.
That was through radar imaging as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that's using seismic surveys to do it. Now, the maps of Antarctica are getting more and more and more sophisticated.
Sure.
And, of course, you now also have to take into account ocean level as well, because we have a different ocean level now than there was 12,000 years ago when Atlantis was supposed to have existed. So, that was the thing that really got me. It was the Kircher map of Atlantis being what I believe to be an accurate map of ice and ice-free Antarctica. And the south is up is a notion that was common in Egypt. For Egypt, south is the top, ancient Egypt.
Yeah.
We regard the north as up and the south as down. They regarded the south as up because that's where the Nile came from. The water came down from the south to the delta. Mm-hmm. So the top of the world, as far as the ancient Egyptians were concerned, was the south. So south is up. So when you take a globe and start to look at the world from south is up. That is one of the keys to understanding how Atlantis has been lost to us because of our own worldviews and also the worldviews that we are trying to filter through. Our concept of ancient worldviews are prejudiced by our assumption of our superiority. Mm-hmm. And I believe, and this has been the essential thing that I believe about Plato's account of Atlantis, which he himself regards not as his own invention, but as simply as a story that had been passed through his ancestors, who in turn had taken it from Egyptian priests, who in turn had recorded records from survivors of Atlantis. So the story that is told in Plato's dialogues of Timesius and Cretius about Solon, who was Plato's ancestor, going 200 years before the time of Plato, but Solon went to Egypt, and he encountered a priest there and got to him talking about the Great Flood and mm-hmm. all the things that had happened in the past. And this priest gives a description. He says, oh, Solon, you Greeks are but children because you remember very little of the ancient past. Mm-hmm. We, on the other hand, have all these records, and some of our records go back 9,000 years. And so that takes us to 9,600 BC, because Solon was in Egypt around 600 BC. So 9,600 BC, because that's an important date to remember.
Very
because
important.
A lot
yeah.
happening at that time. In any case, what happened, and here's the interesting thing. The priest, who I through other research I learned his name was Zonkis, because he was also the tutor to Pythagoras, who was contemporary of Solon. So he taught Pythagoras for 22 years.
Wow.
He had an encounter with Solon when Solon was visiting in Egypt. Well, and that's where the story of Atlantis begins, as far as we know, is that Zonkis tells Solon about Atlantis, and he says, and he tries to describe where Atlantis is to Solon. But Solon's worldview, which is the ancient Greek world, was pretty limited. So he didn't understand what was said, but he was very good at memory, as all the Greeks were at that time, because this is before the times of writing being popular. Really, writing became very popular with Plato and Aristotle 200 years later. The early pre-Socratic philosophers were oral tradition. So they were very good with their memory. So what Solon did is he recorded this description of the location of Atlantis, and in his memory, passed it on to his ancestors, who eventually came to Plato, who was the first to write it down. Now, even Plato, in my view, didn't understand it. He just regurgitated it, if you like. And people have been trying to understand this because there's peculiar notions in it. A real ocean, a whole opposite continent. These are notions that are very, very, very peculiar.
In a way, that's probably not a bad idea that he didn't understand it, because if he was just regurgitating it, he probably would have kept to the facts more than twist or alter some viewpoint that he might have had.
That's my feeling, absolutely. I totally agree with you, James. Without it was their very ignorance that allowed us, because what I'm saying and what I have been saying and Rose and I have been saying, and When the Sky Fell, and then also in the Atlantis Blueprint and Atlantis Beneath the Ice, is that this account is the most sophisticated scientific account of the Earth's geography that we have even as of today. Mm-hmm. It is the most sophisticated. In 2 or 3 sentences, that the description of the entire planet's geography is accurately depicted from the point of view of Antarctica. And that's the thing that throws people off, because we can't imagine looking at the world from Antarctica. But once you start to look at the Earth's geography from Antarctica, then everything that is said in Plato's account makes sense. And I can go through that a little bit if you want.
Yeah.
But that's the bottom line about it.
Well, here's the thing. Let's talk about, the parameters on the world ocean and the Egyptian link with Solon and how it was recorded down, because it was recorded by the Greeks and their worldview, Rand, was different to what our worldview is today, or it'll be different to our worldview in another 2,000 years. So let's get into the Greek worldview and what they were trying to record down and what that actually means in terms of the evidence.
Oh, sure. The main thing to understand about the Greek worldview is, first of all, they believed that the world was a disk.
Sure.
The world was spherical, but the land part of it was in the northern hemisphere and surrounded by water completely, all north, south, east, west. So, all directions. If you went far enough, you would encounter the same ocean, which they called the Atlantic Ocean.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so the Atlantic Ocean doesn't just refer to the North Atlantic Ocean like we do in our European-centered view.
Sure.
It also refers to the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the Arctic Ocean. It's the whole ocean.
Mm-hmm.
So inside that disk are three subdivisions. There's Europe, which is pretty well contemporary with what would be most of Europe. It's pretty similar to what Europe looks like today in terms of geography.
Mm.
But then there had two other features. They had what was called Libya, which we would call North Africa. So it includes all of North Africa, and it's quite a large area. And then what they called Asia, which today we would call the Middle East. So as far as and to the extreme west, there was the Pillars of Hercules, which is the Strait of Gibraltar. Now that has two different meanings to the Greeks. One meaning is the extreme western edge of what we would call the Mediterranean Sea. That's the extremity of it.
Sure.
And that is, and that's one meaning, and that actual strait there. The other meaning was more of a psychological thing. It was the end of the known world.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to go out through those Pillars of Hercules and you didn't know what was out there, that would be daunting, frightening, the unknown back then,
Well, the thing about it, and Plato says it, and so does other Greek writers, poets and stuff. They say, Pindar, for example, says, what lies beyond, nobody knows. Because what happened is that people would go beyond, but they wouldn't come back. So, that was a barrier. So when we say that Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Hercules, it doesn't mean it was to the west. Plato never used the word west, or the Sankas never used the word west. He said it was beyond the Pillars of Hercules. In other words, beyond the Mediterranean Sea. And so it could just as easily be in the Pacific as it is in the Indian. Okay, so that's the Greek worldview, and what we have now come to in our present day, in our satellite time, what I would call now a scientific point of view, is that I'm going to skip over the European point of view because people probably think they know that, but we'll discuss that a little bit. But let's go right to what is a really scientific point of view of the Earth's the planet Earth.
Sure.
First of all, it's, mostly water, and it's one ocean.
70%, 70% water, which is a lot.
Yeah, and it's a one continuous ocean.
Mm.
If you take a globe and look at Antarctica and ask yourself what ocean it's in, today, using our European concepts, what we've invented is this Antarctic Ocean, which is simply an imaginary barrier, which is the polar zone around Antarctica. And then it's also in the South Pacific, it's in the Indian Ocean, and it's in the Atlantic. So we're thinking of different oceans, but there is, according to oceanographers, and this is what they teach in oceanography today and have been for 20, 30 years, is that the Earth has but one ocean, the world ocean. Mm. And this is interesting because in the account that the Egyptian priests gives of the location of Atlantis, he calls the ocean that Atlantis is in by two names. He says it's the Atlantic Ocean, and he also calls it the real ocean.
Mm.
And he says one other thing about it. He says that the Mediterranean is but a bay of this big ocean, a small bay of this big ocean.
Wow.
And all that is true when you start to look at the Earth's geography from a scientific perspective. And because it's not just oceans, there's only one ocean, but we have, in our European-orientated point of view, we see the world from Europe, and that's the way geography has developed because of history. Mm-hmm. But for example, the Middle East. People in the Middle East don't call themselves Middle Easterners. People in the Far East don't call themselves Far Easterners.
Sure.
They call themselves, they're in the Middle Kingdom.
Yeah.
So every place has their own center. And the problem with the European point of view and the history of exploration, which was undertaken by Europeans, is that those perceptions have blinded us to the scientific nature of the description of the location of Atlantis in Plato's account.
Do you know what always bugged me when I was a kid? They talked about Eastern civilization and Western civilization, and I just looked at the globe and I went, well, surely no matter where you stand on the globe, you have East and West, like. So,
exactly.
So that's what you're portraying.
Well, yeah, it's all arbitrary. It's totally arbitrary. Well, the world is democratically round.
Yes.
The only way to look at the world.
That's the best.
Pardon?
Democratically round is a very good way to portray it. Democratically round.
So the other thing, of course, in this description is a description of the continents, and there's this thing called the whole opposite continent that surrounds the real ocean. So here's just as the Atlantean point of view that Zonkus articulated to Plato's ancestor Solon was of like a dartboard. In the middle is Atlantis. It's an island. There's a couple islands off of it, and then there's this big real ocean, and then surrounding on the edges of this, all the way around this big ocean, is a continuous landmass, one continuous landmass, which they called the whole opposite continent. Now that includes, and you can see this in the book and also on our website under the Atlantis and Antarctica, that includes like South America, North America, Europe, Africa, and Asia are all part of one continuous landmass. So from the geographic point of view, from a strictly scientific point of view, a continent is a continuous landmass. Well, in the time of Atlantis, you could walk from the tip of South America to the tip of Africa and never have to cross the ocean. Mm. So all of those land masses, South America, North America, Asia, Europe, Africa, are continuous in terms of being able to walk them, just as the world ocean is continuous. So fundamentally, from a strictly scientific point of view, and with a southern prejudice as opposed to a northern prejudice, and because the Atlanteans were a southern hemisphere, and then I can give other reasons why that is the case, but their perspective is very much Atlantis in the middle, couple of islands off, and then you find this whole opposite continent which encircles the real ocean. So here's I'm just going to read to you the actual words that Plato that Plato wrote when he recorded the words that had once been spoken at 600 BC, and it said that Atlantis was larger than Libya, that's North Africa, and Asia, that's the Middle East combined. So that's exactly the size of Antarctica. Mm. If you see in our map that we can show you that Antarctica is almost exactly the size of North Africa and the Middle East combined. From it, that is from Atlantis, there were passages for seafarers of those times to reach the other islands. These are islands that are now beneath ice. And from them, the whole opposite continent, which surrounds what can truly be called the ocean. for these regions, that is the Mediterranean, that lie within the strait, that is within the Pillars of Hercules, which we were talking about, seem to be but a bay having a narrow entrance. But the other ocean is the real ocean, and the land that entirely surrounds it may be, with the fullest truth and fitness, be named a continent. Those are the words. And
beautiful.
My claim is that is an advanced scientific account of the Earth's geography as seen from Antarctica as it was 9,600 BC.
Like an anthropomorphic projection from somebody from Atlantis, if that is in Antarctica. It's wrote from like an Antarctic viewpoint, if you want to call it that.
That's right. And the thing that made this possible was that there was a U.S. naval support force in Antarctica, and they drew this map from Antarctica, wow. which is also on our website and also in the book, which shows the reality of the real ocean, the one ocean, and they use this map in texts on oceanography to explain to everybody that there is but one ocean, the real ocean, and the rest of the continents do surround it. From that perspective. So what we're saying here is that there was advanced geographic knowledge of the Earth's entire planet, encapsulated in 2 or 3 sentences that were put into recorded history, passed from an Egyptian priest to a visiting Greek dignitary, who passed it on to his son, and then his nephew, and then it came to Plato. What
do the Egyptologists think of Solon and the 9600 BC thing, Rand? Are they silent about it? Does it not exist to them?
Well, the tendency among all of academia today, and I can go into the origins of this, but right now, is that everything is an exaggeration, that Plato's exaggerating. It's not 9,600 BC, it's 960 years ago. Or it's not bigger than North Libya and Asia, it's between Libya and Asia. And, they have to, everything has been. And this really started with Charles Lyell, who was the founder of modern geology. Sure. He's kingpin of geology, the grand master, the Darwin of geology. And he begins his book, which was a huge seller in the 19th century, starting out with saying that. He's disbelieving the flood, and he thinks that the Bible, it shouldn't be the source, which may or may not be true for our understanding of anything, and that we have to really rely upon what we see in the present and everything, and that all these myths about a great flood are just exaggerations of local events.
I think this Charles Lyell guy would be eating his words today, though, Rand, in all fairness, because there's so many flood myths around the world, and what a time frame for Plato to pick. I mean, he nailed it on the head, this 9600 BC, Rand. I mean, this was...
Well, yeah, this is the thing that again, in addition to giving a scientific point of view of the world from the southern perspective, he pinpoints the time of the Great Flood to 9,600 BC, which is commonly regarded today as the end of the Ice Age and the beginning of what we call the Holocene, the end of the Pleistocene and the Holocene. It is the pivotal point in geography and geology that from our modern era. And it's an era of melting ice caps in North America, rising ocean. For 6,000 years the ocean rose, and now it's starting to go down again. But during that first part, there was tremendous flooding. And the Zonkas, again, the Egyptian priest, who had access to the Atlantean records, said that there was an explanation for the Great Flood that is related to the story of Phaeton and the falling sky. And of course, we go into that quite a bit in our book. The falling sky flood myths are also called the sun deluge myths, and they are around the world, all around the world.
Sure.
People using different mechanisms, if you like, have the same story, which is there's a change in the sky, most often measured by the sun not going its normal way, or the stars, or the sky falling, and then the flood comes. So the flood is the second event. The first event is the falling sky, or the change in the sun's position of the sun in the sky, and that we, of course, are using the theory of Earth crust displacement to explain that.
Mm. Okay, let's stop there a second, Rand. Right, we're going to get into Earth crust displacement because I think this is important because the book is called Atlantis Beneath the Ice. And we're saying Atlantis is beneath the ice because of the maps. And so let's get Charles Hapgood brought into this point because you corresponded with Charles Hapgood and he had this theory of Earth crust displacement. And it perhaps that Atlantis got shoved into its present position, and that would, if the Earth crust displacement did happen, that would explain why, if you were on the crust and it shifted, it would explain why the sun is in a different position. So let's kind of roll out this theory of Earth crust displacement. It's a good time to bring it in.
Okay, well, Charles Hapgood he went to Harvard. His teaching was interrupted by the Second World War. He also went to university in Germany. He was fluent in German, and he was in Germany during the rise of the Nazis. So when the Second World War broke out, he came back to America and joined the OSS, which was that was what the CIA was known at, Operations of Special Services. They were the first spy agency for the American, and he worked in that department because he had inside knowledge about Nazi Germany.
Sure.
After the war, he got picked up by a couple of different colleges, and he became a professor. And then in the early 50s, he got interested in Atlantis, and by students kept bringing it up in his history of science classes, and so he started to investigate it a little bit, and and through that he also had a friend, an older fellow, in his 30 years older than he was, and who was a physicist, and he understood. They first came up with the idea that there must have, what destroyed Atlantis, that's what they were interested in. Their first thought was that it must have been a change in the Earth's axis, that somehow the axis of the Earth changed. And when they started to investigate that, that's when they, of course, began corresponding with Albert Einstein. Now, Albert Einstein recorded his material is recorded flawlessly. Everything that he wrote to everybody has been recorded by his secretary, and it's in their archives. Yeah. So anybody who wants to go into and see whether or not there was correspondence between Hapgood and Einstein can now do that online, and just put in Einstein and Hapgood and Jerusalem, and that'll probably do it. Anyway, this correspondence between Einstein and Hapgood led to him modifying his idea that it wasn't the Earth's axis that shifted, but just simply the outer shell of the Earth, which is called the crust, or the scientists call it the lithosphere. It's all of the outer crust of the Earth. Some parts of it are ocean, some parts of it are continent. Don't think of them as the continents being separate. They're all part of the same shell. Yeah. And the outer shell of this, which is only 1/3 of 1% of the Earth's mass,
wow,
is shifted. And when it shifts, of course, you move from you might be in a temperate zone and you ended up in a polar zone. Or you might be in a temperate zone and you end up in a tropical zone, or you could be in a temperate zone and end up in a polar zone. And that's what happened to Atlantis. It was a third of Antarctica, the side, people now call it Lesser Antarctica. It's still the size of Western Europe. The side towards South America, we contend was temperate before the last Earth crust displacement, which occurred at 9,600 BC, just as Zonka said it did. And a third of the continent, the other 2/3 was under ice. It was still a white continent, and there are mentions throughout world mythology of the notion of a civilization in the middle of the ocean that was white. Now, Antarctica was white even then, and of course in the winter it would be all white. But in the summer, a third of the continent, and again, this is a huge continent. Don't forget that Antarctica is about the size of the United States. So, it's a big area, and it was temperate. And moreover, it had ocean currents going all the way around it from all directions that would have warmed it. So it would have been warmer than even the latitude. Some of the latitudes that it were like at 55. But, that's like parts of Alaska are like that. Sure, you get winters, but sure, it's pretty mild as well.
Sure. I have to say, at this point, Rand, I'm in the north of Ireland, and we're at the same latitude as Labrador in Canada. And we're getting a heat wave now at 27.5 degrees, which is like...
Oh, my gosh.
It's ridiculous for this northerly latitude. Like, it's absolutely ridiculous, like. But Canada and these latitudes can get pretty warm, like.
Absolutely. Well, I live on Vancouver Island on the west coast of Canada, and we don't get snow as a novelty. It's a real novelty. I mean, practically everybody shuts down just to enjoy it because it's so rare.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So, and I'm at the 49th parallel, so like 2 degrees below London, say. So, we have a mild climate here because of the ocean. The Pacific Ocean is bringing warm water to us. And the same thing was true of Atlantis. And in the Atlantis blueprints, we talk about the Atlantis Channel, which was because the continent and the ocean levels were different. There was a series of islands off of Antarctica, and there was a strait that went between the main part of the continent and these other islands. And that would have brought warm water through there, and that would have made it warmer than even the latitudes indicate.
Yeah, I should just say at this point, I have a copy of the Charles Hapgood's book, The Path of the Pole.
Yes.
And there's a foreword by Albert Einstein in that actual book, the letter from Albert Einstein. And
yes, it is.
Albert Einstein endorsed it. He quite liked his theories, didn't he? And Charles Hapgood wrote books, the Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings as well. He really delved into this in an academic manner, and I can really understand your correspondence with Charles Hapgood. And I remember you were talking about the time he departed us on this planet, and how that much of an impact it had on you too as well, Rand, because you had a friend.
Yeah, that was very, we had just, we were getting into some heavy duty correspondence because,
and all of a sudden.
I started in 1977 corresponding with him. And then what I decided to do with the Earth crust displacement theory to try to give it credibility was not to say anything about Atlantis because, that's taboo, but to show that theory of Earth crust displacement could be an explanation for the origins of agriculture. And so I researched for a year or two the origins of agriculture, and I showed that the kind of climatic change that was predicted by this Earth crust displacement that Charles Hapgood created in association with Albert Einstein can explain the geographic location of the origins of agriculture around the world. And I sent that off to an academic journal in Canada. It was Anthropological Journal of Canada. It was the first one I sent it off to, and they made it the lead article.
Mm-hmm.
But then nothing happened.
Sure.
So what? Like, it just, even though people, I've shown that this problem, the origins of agriculture, which is
it's all high altitude.
Pretty important to civilization, can be explained, and it's been around for 150 years, people trying to explain it, can be explained simply with this theory of Earth crust displacement.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's all, the origins of agriculture is all at high altitude. It's always at high altitude, and it's like, nobody addresses that. And I haven't heard anybody address that like you do. And in fairness, I do say I don't know if you agree with this, or I'm not trying to big you up, but, you do have a good continuation of Charles Hapgood. You have carried the flag, like, you have kept the torch running, like. You've gone and kept that continuation of Charles Hapgood's research, like. I don't know anybody else that does that. I don't know anybody else that has around.
That has been my mission. That's what I have been doing.
Mm.
And the thing that's frustrating, we were talking about learning of his death. I was in London at the time. I was reading at the
British Museum.
The British Museum when the library was still in the museum there.
What a museum that is, Rand, eh?
Well, what a librbery resource too.
What a library as well, yeah.
When I was living in British Columbia, it took me 6 months to get a rare or odd book. When I was in London, it would take me an hour. It was so like I was just reading up the storm when I was there. Anyway, I was supposed to have lunch with Rose, because I was expecting this correspondence from Charles, and Rose came up with a letter, and it said return to sender deceased. And I later learned out that he was killed as a pedestrian in an automobile accident. So his last letter to me, he had spoken of the possibility that civilization was much, much older, and that letter was the basis of the Atlantis Blueprint book, which I wrote with Colin Wilson.
Sure.
But it was very, very disheartening to have him die prematurely. Just as our correspondence was really starting to heat up. Sure. But I had corresponded with him for 5 years, so I got a lot out of it, and sure. I do consider him my mentor. And I do consider that I have tried to be his protege.
Mm-hmm. Here's the thing for me, and the Albert Einstein, a lot of people say because the Earth is not spherical, people think as the Earth is it. We see globes on, we see our globes in the house and we spin them and they're all spherically, perfectly spheres. But the Earth is actually an obloid. But here's the thing, I'm from a physics background, and I think this is actually enhancing the Earth's crust displacement, not negating it. Because they say, well, if it's an obloid, like a flattened sphere, like flattened at the poles, like, they say that, well, then the Earth couldn't shift around because it's not like the skin of an orange. But if it was the skin of an orange, it could just go totally spinning, like, and it wouldn't stop. But I think the fact that it's obloid, it will shift, but then stop at some point. It's the braking mechanism. That's what I think. You
are absolutely right. That is exactly it. The equatorial bulge acts as a brake upon the displacement. Otherwise, like you say, in space, once something starts moving, there has to be something to stop it. Otherwise, it just continues.
Exactly.
So we would have had this not only a revolving thing that we're going through with the Earth's axis, but we would have also had this other thing happening, going like north-south and south-north kind of thing, as well as east-west happening, and then we would just be in this, like in a spinning ride at an amusement park or something, for
nightmare continuously.
Yeah.
So okay, right. there's other evidence too, and that's what Hapgood got into was this ice sheet problem, because I never got this. Like, there's two camps. There's people say, and I think this is dissipating now, this theory, but like that Antarctica is a million years of ice. There's a million years of ice there. It's been there for, but like there is ice core samples that, I mean, Hapgood was thorough in his research. It wasn't just about the maps, and we haven't got into the maps yet, but there's ice core samples that show sediment from fresh rivers. Like, in other words, rivers were flowing because they have the sediments in the ice, and the sediments can only come from flowing rivers. And there's three types of sediments.
Here's the thing that I agree with all of what you're saying. But here's the thing that I think that really puts it into perspective. We know that every place on the Earth has its antipodes. That is, there's an opposite side of the Earth.
Yeah.
New Zealand is nearly antipodal to the British Isles.
Sure.
A little bit warmer. North Pole, South Pole.
Yeah.
China, South America, North America, South Asia. Yeah, okay. So opposite to the area that we're talking about in Lesser Antarctica, which is the part towards South America. This is where we think Atlantis was. Opposite to that is Siberia and Beringia. Okay, so Siberia, Alaska, and the landmass that no longer exists. Huge, all that area up there. We have extensive Russian scientific and American in Alaska investigations showing that area, during the last ice age, supposedly, there wasn't ice. There was all sorts of animals living there. Animals, they call it like, large scale, not just the mammoths and mastodons, but deer and antelope and cherry. There's a 90-foot cherry tree found on the New Siberian Islands.
Wow.
So, and these are now well within the Arctic Circle.
And the woolly mammoths, they had the fresh buttercups in the belly, didn't they? That's the big clincher for me. Like, these guys were eating fresh buttercups and got frozen overnight.
Yes. That cannot. These problems. When a problem in science cannot be explained by the prevailing paradigm, they're ignored. Mm-hmm. They just ignore them, and until so many of them pile up, that there has to be a breakthrough and a new paradigm comes about. And I believe that Earth crust displacement now is a paradigm shift. And
should be an opportunity, though, Rand, shouldn't it? I mean, when problems arise, you have two ways of looking at it: ignore it, or you see it as an opportunity to change, an opportunity to evolve, change, enlighten, turn that problem around, and use it to your advantage. That's what it should be. That's a human trait to do that.
I think anomalies are signposts to discovery.
Exactly, Rand. Exactly.
And if you ignore them, you can just stay on the main highway.
Yeah.
But if you see an anomaly off the main highway, mm-hmm. and it's a real problem, then follow it, because it's going to lead you to a discovery. Mm-hmm. If I could say one thing to anybody who really wanted to understand how science really operates, and this is something that Einstein emphasized again and again, and he did personally to Hapgood, it's curiosity. Keep your mind curious. Look for things that don't fit. Mm-hmm. Who cares about the things that fit? Things that fit are, okay, that's done. Mm-hmm. Let's look at the things that don't fit. Because when we look at the things that don't fit, I have, on our website, I have a section called Bits That Don't Fit. and it's just about things that don't fit the prevailing notions of what science is or isn't. Mm-hmm. If you don't have curiosity and you're not willing to chase those anomalies, then all you're going to get is regurgitation of what has happened before. You'll get refinements, and sure, but you won't get breakthroughs. Mm-hmm. And this is why, when you look at Thomas Kuhn, who is the most famous sociologist, a scientist, he wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And the reason he said that so many of the scientific revolutions have occurred by people who weren't taught in the discipline in which they made their discovery was because they didn't have the fixations of that. They weren't indoctrinated into the paradigm, and then that indoctrination. Einstein said another thing. I don't know how curiosity survives the education system. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So like this is it. Anomaly. Anything that doesn't work. Or seems
why
odd
is a great
about
question, Rand. I always teach my nephews, and one niece, and I always say, always ask the question why. I drum it into them, because why gives you the answers. Why is this? Why is that? I love to see kids asking the question why, because it's a sign of intelligence, it's a sign of curiosity, as you say. The best question of all, if you ask me.
And again and again, the big scientific breakthroughs occurred not by people who were taught in the field, but people who came from outside the field and looked at the situation like a child, afresh.
Rand, let's get into some of these maps, because this is the real, juicy stuff for me as well, because
okay, sure.
The maps are absolutely astounding. These are jaw-dropping because they're like, tangible evidence. And let's just explain for the listeners, Rand. Cartography is a very high science, is it not? It's like, it's advanced, there's so much in it. Like you say, the U.S. Naval have took some of these, the cartographic section have taken some of these maps and come up with some very startling results.
Absolutely. First of all, people don't have to. It's easy enough to understand latitude. You point at the sun and you measure. You can guesstimate the angle, and so like where I am, I'm at the 49th parallel. So the sun, is near the 49th, an angle of 49 degrees. So doing north-south, that's an easy thing. You can do that anywhere. You can do that at sea.
Yeah.
But east-west, being able to turn a longitude, that's a function of being able to know the time at one place and then the location where you are, and then to calculate the distance difference. And that's why the British Board of Longitude offered a fortune.
£20,000 Rand in.
Yeah, it was a fortune in those days.
Yeah. For
somebody to come up with a way to calculate longitude at sea. And it wasn't really achieved. The first person, Captain Cook in the 1770s, was the first one who actually started mapping the world in South America and west coast of British Columbia and Hawaii and all these other places with a marine chronometer. This is a very sophisticated timepiece. You cannot lose seconds, and even today, the U.S. Navy, in the event of all the satellites being knocked out, the GPS is gone and everything, they have these little clocks,
Sure.
And if they can't lose a second over a year, because if you lose a second, you can be that's the difference of miles in distance. So the precision of these marine chronometer that was eventually created, and that whole story of longitude is a great, fascinating story. There's a book called Longitude that anybody who's interested in that should probably read. It's a very short book, and it's very good. But anyway, being able to map continents requires a certain level of sophistication. And that level of sophistication in the modern time wasn't reached until the 1770s. So these ancient maps, which are accurate within half a degree of longitude on many, many points of the parts of the continents that they're showing, like South America, subglacial Antarctica, Europe, Africa, even parts of Asia, they are all within, many points are accurate within half a degree of longitude. And some of them are even less than that, like a quarter of a degree of accuracy. So the level of sophistication to be able to draw maps of that level requires a certain amount of technological advancement. And so we can say that the ancient people who drew these maps, and these maps have been in print, in books, in the 16th century, a century before the marine chronometer was being used. Like I say, the Kirker map of Atlantis was published in 1665. The Piri Reis map is 1513.
Yeah.
So they're like 2 centuries ahead of the technology required to create maps like that. And we didn't know what Antarctica looked like, even vaguely, about beneath the ice until 1958. That's like 3 centuries after Kirker's book had been published.
That was through radar imaging as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that's using seismic surveys to do it. Now, the maps of Antarctica are getting more and more and more sophisticated.
Sure.
And of course, you now also have to take into account ocean level as well, because we have a different ocean level now than there was 12,000 years ago when Atlantis was supposed to have existed. So, that was the thing that really got me. It was the Kirker map of Atlantis being what I believe to be an accurate map of ice and ice-free Antarctica. And the south is up is a notion that was common in Egypt. For Egypt, south is the top, ancient Egypt.
Yeah.
We regard the north as up and the south as down. They regarded the south as up because that's where the Nile came from. The water came down from the south to the delta. Mm-hmm. So the top of the world, as far as the ancient Egyptians were concerned, was the south. So south is up. So when you take a globe and start to look at the world from south is up, that is one of the keys to understanding how Atlantis has been lost to us because of our own worldviews and also the worldviews that we are trying to filter through. Our concept of ancient worldviews are prejudiced by our assumption of our superiority. Mm-hmm. And I believe, and this has been the essential thing that I believe about Plato's account of Atlantis, and he says, and he tries to describe where Atlantis is to Solon. But Solon's worldview, which is the ancient Greek world, was pretty limited. So he didn't understand what was said, but he was very good at memory, as all the Greeks were at that time, because this is before the times of writing being popular. Really, writing became very popular with Plato and Aristotle 200 years later. The early pre-Socratic philosophers were oral tradition. So they were very good with their memory. So what Solon did is he recorded this description of the location of Atlantis, and in his memory, passed it on through his ancestors, who eventually came to Plato, who was the first to write it down. Now, even Plato, in my view, didn't understand it. He just regurgitated it, if you like. And people have been trying to understand this because there's peculiar notions in it. A real ocean, a whole opposite continent. These are notions that are very, very, very peculiar.
In a way, sorry, Ron, in a way, that's probably not a bad idea that he didn't understand it, because if he was just regurgitating it, he probably would have kept to the facts more than twist or alter some viewpoint that he might have had.
That's my feeling, absolutely. I totally agree with you, James. Without his, it was their very ignorance that allowed us, because what I'm saying and what I have been saying and Rose and I have been saying, and When the Sky Fell, and then also in the Atlantis Blueprint and Atlantis Beneath the Ice, is that this account is the most sophisticated scientific account of the Earth's geography that we have even as of today. Mm-hmm. It is the most sophisticated. In 2 or 3 sentences, that the description of the entire planet's geography is accurate.
let's get into some of your background, Rand. What got you into this? It always puzzles me when people research Atlantis. I go, what got you into Atlantis? What is it? A mystery? Was there some facts laid in front of you, or was there some sort of anomaly that you've seen, or what's your route in to look for Atlantis, and how does it all come about for you?
Like in one weekend, I've told this story many times, and I don't want it to be overemphasized because I only spent one weekend doing this. But I was writing a science fiction script, and I just came up with the idea of putting Atlantis in Antarctica in the science fiction script. Now, I went off to the library and started to do some research about Atlantis, and that's when it turned from being a script into a research project, which I then continued on for decades. And what I found at the library was a map of Atlantis that was in a book created in 1665. Athanasius Kircher, he was a Jesuit priest living in Rome. And he had access to all the loot that the Romans had taken from the Egyptians. So he found this map, and he reproduced it in a book in 1665. And that map, which you often will see, is a map of Atlantis, supposedly in the North Atlantic Ocean. And it's peculiar in the sense that there's a little compass on it that points down, which means that north is down. So you have to turn the map upside down to get our orientation. I came to that map with the concept of, hey, listen, rather than turning the map upside down, maybe we should turn our globe upside down and look at it. And at that time, I came across Charles Hapgood's book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. And in it, for the first time for me, there was a picture of an ice-free Antarctica. And the thing that struck me about it was that Kircher's 1665 map of Atlantis was a remarkably similar map to an ice-free Antarctica. And of course, this is in the book Atlantis Beneath the Ice and on our website under Atlantis in Antarctica. But the thing about it was it seems more than coincidence to me. It seems, because I knew that in 1665, Europeans weren't capable of determining longitude at sea. That didn't happen until the 1770s.
That's the bombshell, Rand. Sorry, Rand. That's the bombshell, isn't it? If this is true, then this is like mammoth. This is a mammoth concept.
Yeah. See, for what it meant to me was that, hey, now there is a piece of physical evidence, this map that Kircher published in 1665, which is a remarkably accurate map of Antarctica without the ice. And Atlantis, which he himself regards not as his own invention, but as simply as a story that had been passed through his ancestors, who in turn had taken it from Egyptian priest, who in turn had recorded records from survivors of Atlantis. So the story that is told in Plato's dialogues of Timesius and Critias about Solon, who was Plato's ancestor, going 200 years before the time of Plato, but Solon went to Egypt, and he encountered a priest there and got to him talking about the Great Flood and all the things that had happened in the past. And this priest gives a description. He says, oh, Solon, you Greeks are but children because you remember very little of the ancient past. We, on the other hand, have all these records, and some of our records go back 9,000 years. And so that takes us to 9,600 BC, because Solon was in Egypt around 600 BC. So 9,600 BC, because that's an important date to remember.
Very
because
important.
A lot happening at that time. In any case, what happened, and here's the interesting thing. the priest who through other research I learned his name was Zonkis, because he was also the tutor to Pythagoras, who was contemporary of Solon. So he taught Pythagoras for 22 years.
Wow.
He had an encounter with Solon when Solon was visiting in Egypt. Well, and that's where the story of Atlantis begins, as far as we know, is that Zonkis tells Solon about